All right, diving into the material you shared this week, two major things really jumped out at me from Washington.
Hmm.
We saw a high-profile figure leave a government role, and, well, a significant court challenge hit a key economic policy.
Yeah, quite a confluence of events.
Exactly. So our mission today, in this deep dive, is to cut through the noise, get to the essential facts, explore the implications, and maybe uncover some surprising details hidden in these
Sounds
sources.
good.
These aren't just Beltway headlines, right? They touch on fundamental ideas about government efficiency, economic direction, and the checks and balances that really do have a ripple effect far beyond DC.
It's fascinating how these two distinct events, one centered on an individual advisor in government operations, the other a legal challenge to broad economic policy, both unfolded on the very same day.
Yeah, it
It
is.
really highlights different kinds of pressure points within the government.
It really does. Let's start with the high-profile departure then. According to the sources, on Wednesday, May 28, 2025, Elon Musk announced on his platform X that his time in the Trump administration was, quote, coming to an end.
That's right. He was serving in a specific capacity, known as a special government employee,
Right.
which is a temporary role. It's limited by statute to 130 days per year. So his mandate was naturally set to expire right around May 30th.
Okay.
So the timing wasn't completely out of the blue, based on that limit.
Right, right. And the White House confirmed the departure was in process with the offboarding starting that Wednesday night. What did he actually say were his reasons for leaving?
Well, in his post, he expressed gratitude to President Trump for the opportunity, specifically mentioning his focus on reducing wasteful spending.
Okay.
He also stated that the DOGE, which stands for his Department of Government Efficiency effort, quote, will only strengthen and become a way of life throughout the government.
The DOG initiative definitely captured attention. But reading the sources, the circumstances around his exit felt, well, quick and a bit unceremonious. It was described as being decided at a senior staff level without a formal, direct conversation with President Trump himself. That seems a bit surprising for such a prominent figure.
Yes, that detail stood out. The reports indicate it wasn't a personal conversation with the president, but a decision made within the senior staff.
Interesting.
However, despite his personal departure, both Musk and the administration maintained that the core efforts of DOGE, aiming to restructure and shrink the federal government, are intended to continue.
So while the 130-day limit was approaching, he actually been signaling his intentions to return to his business ventures throughout that week, hadn't he?
He had, yeah.
And he wasn't shy about voicing some specific frustrations either.
Absolutely. A significant point highlighted in the source material is his rather sharp criticism of what was called the president's marquee tax bill.
Ah,
He argued it was too expensive and would significantly increase the federal deficit.
and he had that very pointed quote about it, something about size versus beauty.
Exactly. He's quoted saying, I think a bill can be big or it could be beautiful, but I don't know if it could be both. And he tied this directly to his DOGE work, stating the bill, quote, undermines the work he was trying to do focusing on government efficiency.
And just to add context, the sources describe that bill proposing multi-trillion-dollar tax breaks, increased spending on defense and national security,
Right.
funded by cuts elsewhere. And the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, had estimated it would add, what, $3.8 trillion to the deficit?
That CBO estimate is key context for his critique, definitely. His point was that adding substantially to the deficit seemed counter to a mission focused on, well, efficiency and fiscal responsibility.
Makes sense. And how did President Trump respond to Musk's public criticism of his major tax proposal?
The sources indicated President Trump largely brushed off Musk's comments publicly,
Oh,
suggesting he expected changes to the bill anyway as it went through the Senate and, potential negotiations.
so beyond the tax bill, were there other reported areas of friction, things that might have contributed to his disillusionment or hastened his exit?
Yes, the reports mentioned other points of tension, things like butting heads with some cabinet officials, public disagreements like attacking Peter Navarro,
Right.
and frustrations related to things like the Abu Dhabi Open AI deal.
Mm.
There was also some speculation that his significant spending and the subsequent failure in that Wisconsin judicial race earlier in the year might have influenced his feeling of disillusionment, sort of, with political endeavors.
And of course, his time in government overlapped with some significant business challenges for him personally.
Sure.
Tesla sales saw a notable drop 13% in the first quarter, I think, and the stock price was volatile. He stated he'll be allocating far more time back to Tesla now.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The sources even mention calls for Tesla boycotts and instances of vandalism occurring during this period.
The intersection of his public, politically linked role and the performance of his primary business is certainly a significant factor in the backdrop of his departure. He himself indicated a shift back towards focusing on his companies.
Okay, so that paints the picture of Musk's departure, the context, and some of the underlying frustrations revealed in the sources. Now, let's pivot to the other major development that happened on the very same day, May 28th.
Right, the court ruling.
Exactly. A major U.S. court ruling that delivered a significant blow to another key piece of the Trump administration's economic strategy.
This was a ruling from the U.S. Court of International Trade in Manhattan. And what's striking is that a unanimous panel of 3 judges ruled most of President Trump's global tariffs illegal and effectively blocked them.
Most of them. That's a strong word. What was the court's fundamental basis for this decision?
Well, the court sided with the plaintiffs, which included a group of Democratic-led states and small businesses. Their core finding was that President Trump had, quote, wrongfully invoked a specific emergency law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, as the justification for implementing the bulk of these levies.
IEEPA. Okay, so which specific tariffs were impacted by this ruling?
It applies to the broad global flat tariff, the elevated rates imposed on countries like China, and maybe surprisingly, the fentanyl-related tariffs that have been placed on China, Canada, and Mexico.
Wow, God.
But it's important to note, however, that other tariffs imposed under different laws, like the Section 232 tariffs, based on national security, think steel and aluminum,
Right.
or Section 301 tariffs often used against unfair trade practices, those were not affected by this specific ruling.
Got it. And what did the court order the administration to do?
The court gave the administration 10 days to effectuate its order, basically blocking these specific tariffs permanently.
Permanently, unless...
Unless a higher appeals court were to reinstate them while the litigation continues.
So let's really dig into the why behind the judge's ruling that they were illegal. What was their key legal reasoning for rejecting the use of IEPA here?
The judge's reasoning was quite specific. They fundamentally rejected the government's argument that IEPA granted the president the authority to impose such broad, sweeping tariffs.
Okay.
They stated that IEPA is a law typically used to deal with financial transactions during declared emergencies, not for implementing wide-ranging tariffs as a, trade or economic lever.
And it seems the government's own description of the tariff's purpose actually kind of hurt their case. The sources noted the judges cited the government's concession that the tariffs were intended to pressure other countries.
That's a crucial point. The judges highlighted that the government itself admitted these tariffs were designed to pressure other nations.
Right.
The court argued that using an emergency power meant for financial controls, simply to burden other countries through tariffs, didn't fit the proper scope or intent of the IEPA statute in this context.
And at the heart of this, there is a fundamental constitutional principle at play, isn't there?
Absolutely. The court circled back to the U.S. Constitution, which grants Congress the exclusive authority to regulate commerce with other countries.
Mm-hmm.
They determined that the president's emergency powers under IEPA, as they were applied here, did not override Congress's specific constitutional power over tariffs and commerce.
It's interesting that the court didn't even need to rule on all the arguments the plaintiffs brought forward.
Yes, exactly. They didn't have to weigh in on the argument that President Trump had potentially declared a false national emergency in the first place. The court found that his use of the IEPA statute itself was improper, regardless of the validity of the emergency declaration, making that particular point unnecessary for their decision.
Okay. How did the financial markets respond to this unexpected ruling?
Well, markets reacted positively, at least initially. Stock futures saw a jump, the U.S. dollar strengthened, and the Japanese yen tumbled.
So, optimism.
Generally interpreted as optimism, about a potential reduction in trade friction globally. However, market analysts were quick to caution that any relief might be temporary.
Right.
Precisely because the administration immediately signaled its intention to appeal.
Which is the next step. The Justice Department has filed a notice of appeal.
Correct. This sets up a potential legal battle, probably at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And given the significant implications for global trade and executive power,
Yeah.
it could very well ultimately end up before the U.S. Supreme Court.
And there's a potentially massive financial consequence if this ruling is ultimately upheld on appeal, isn't there? A lot of money involved.
Yes, the sources, specifically referencing a report from the Kobesi letter, highlighted a significant implication. If this ruling is upheld, all the tariffs collected under these now blocked orders since April 2nd would reportedly need to be refunded.
All of them. Wow.
They estimated this could cost around $10 billion in tariff revenue,
10.
with potentially $3.5 billion of that amount owed back to China alone. That's a significant number.
No kidding. So there you have it. On the very same day, you have Elon Musk departing a role focused on government efficiency and cutting spending amidst friction over a major tax bill, and a major court ruling blocking significant tariffs that were justified under emergency powers, raising questions about executive authority over economic policy and trade.
Indeed. These events, happening in such close proximity, offer a fascinating look at both the internal challenges of implementing large-scale reform within the government
Right.
and the external limits placed on executive power, in this case by the judiciary, in areas traditionally governed by Congress. They really highlight different facets of the pressures and constraints faced in Washington right now.
So consider what this specific combination of events reveals about the interplay between executive ambition, legislative authority, and judicial oversight, especially in areas like government spending and trade policy. What does it tell us about the challenges faced by initiatives aiming for drastic change like DOGE, especially when they interact with, established powers and legal structures? And maybe what questions does this raise for you about how power is exercised and challenged in the U.S. government and how those dynamics ultimately affect policies that impact the economy and, well, your daily life?